We are going to be using a Uniball Vision fine black ink pen. This is a waterproof, fade-proof ink. I like to use this for pen and ink techniques when I'm teaching the techniques. So we're going to be using that for, excuse me, we're going to be using it for hatching, cross-hatching, and scribble. And then we'll use a felt tip marker for the stippling and pencil for the shading on the sphere. So with hatching is just using lines that are one directional only. When you shade one of the forms or any drawing where you're trying to imitate a surface, you want to use your lines to mimic the curve or the texture of that surface. In this case, we've got a cone. A cone is curved in one direction. And I always explain to my kids what I mean by one direction is you can take a piece of paper, and you can shape it into a cone-like shape. You can take a piece of paper and you can shape it into a cylinder-like shape. You can take a piece of paper and make a box. Taking a piece of paper to make a sphere is difficult because a sphere's surface is is curved in all directions versus just one direction. So that's what I'm referring to there. So what that means is we've got arrows here indicating where the highlight should be. So we're gonna start, and I always turn my paper for this, and I'm going to use a piece of scrap paper to cover my value scale so that I don't smudge it. And I'm gonna start on this side. And now the hand, when you bend your hand, you have a natural curve because of your wrist. So I always try to turn the paper so that I can use that natural curve. And I'm going to start on this far edge. And I'm just doing small lines. They don't have to all be the same direction, or pardon me, the same length. You don't want them the same length. But I'm starting them all from this opposite edge because this opposite side would be where the most shadow would be. So when you shade a cone, the shading pattern kind of follows the shape of the cone. So it's going to be narrower at the top and wider at the bottom. Okay, so I always tell my students that if you're making wider lines down here, up here it has to be very narrow. And now I'm going to start overlapping, but again, I'm varying the length of my line. And I'm going to start bringing a few, not a lot of them, but a few over to this side. Trying to curve my lines as I go. Okay, we're only making the lines go in one direction. We're not crisscrossing them at all because that's cross-hatching. And then the more layers of lines you put on, the darker the value is going to appear. So if you see that you've got some empty areas that you want to fill in on this opposite edge, do that. So that is hatching. Cross-hatching is crisscrossing your lines. So I'm going to put that back on there. And we've got our highlight over here, so that means I'm starting from this edge. And again, like I said before, we've got a curved surface, so I'm curving my lines. Not very well this morning. Admittedly, pen and ink is not my favorite because it's not very forgiving. If you mess up, you either have to start again or go with it. All right, so I've got my curved lines there. Now I'm going to do my crisscrossing lines. I'm going to go from this direction. Again, to kind of go with the shape of a can or a cylinder. And now as I get over here into the medium sections, I'm going to make shorter and sparser lines that are farther away from each other. I feel like I need to add a few more over on this side to add those darker values in more. Notice I'm not just blindly crisscrossing. I'm trying to be very deliberate in how I add my lines. Now on the top here, I'm going to shade this, smooth that in a little bit more. There we go. I'm going to shade this so that it looks like the cylinder is open on top, which means I'm going to shade from this side. Now since I'm doing the ellipse on the top, I'm making my curved lines kind of follow the top or the bottom curve, and in the center they're kind of going straight across. You always want to try to keep a contrast between your surfaces too. So there we have cross hatching, and again, I feel like this is not my best work, but you get the idea. I also like these because you can control how heavy or light the line is. All right, so for stippling, we've got our light coming from over here. Stippling is just dots, and you don't want to make them in rows. And again, you don't want to go too fast because then you'll get tails on them. So you have to kind of go slow and deliberately. For those of you who are not patient people, this is a good patience exercise. You want to keep the dots randomly located. You don't want them in a pattern. I tell my students if I can hear their pen hitting the paper, it's too loud and you're pushing too hard and going too fast. Also, if they're making noise with their pen tips, that means they're also damaging the pen tips and being too hard on them. So this is going to be the darkest side. So I don't want to color it in, but I want the dots to be pretty dense and definitely overlapping. And I want to look for any areas where there's like a bigger white section. Here it looks pretty light, so I'm going to go up here and fill this in a little bit more. I feel like that's pretty good. I can always come back, and now I'm going to do the medium side. Now the light's coming from here, so it might be a little bit more dense on this lower corner and a little less dense on the upper corner. But I'm just going to go in and add, oops, I'm going too fast. Go in and add kind of a base layer like when I was shading up here. again, this is a good thing to hold back from yourself and look at it from a different perspective a few times, because it's easy to just kind of go into dot mode and overdo it so you don't have your values like you want them to be. Now up here is going to be the lightest value, so these dots are going to be spread out and more sparsely used. And that is stippling. All right, so on this one, oops, we're going to be using a Uniball pen again. And this one is scribbling, but it's not just obviously blind scribbling, it's intentional scribbling. The light's hitting on this side, so this side's going to be shadowed. And my scribbles end up being kind of like messy figure eight-ish S-curve kind of. You could do different, you could do straight lines with sharp corners. You could do curly cues. But when I scribble for shading, this is usually how mine turns out. It's a very fast, it goes very fast. And then on here, we want to have a lighter to medium. So I'm going to do larger and more spread out. And then over here, I'm going to overlap it just a little bit more, like this, kind of fill in my corners. And for, oh my gosh, I think for the sphere, we've got the highlight coming here, and I always have my students kind of visualize an oval here for the highlight, and then concentric ovals that are kind of lopsided that loop all the way back. Have them, if they want to draw them, I tell them to draw it light, but then your darker areas are going to be all the way around here. Oops. And I need to cover this up again, or I'm going to smudge it. Because when I'm shading a sphere, my paper turns every which way. And I also tell my students, when you're shading a sphere, use a circular pattern when you're shading. It takes a little bit longer to do the shading at the beginning, but then you don't actually have to really smooth your lines out because you've already got that, that circular texture. And so while it feels like it's taking longer at the beginning, in the end you don't have to go back and rework anything. So I bring my dark all very narrowly all the way around the edge. And then I start letting up on my pressure. And I work the whole sphere at the same time so that those layers are blending. I kind of go back and forth. And I'm following that pattern that I sketched out on there. By the time you're done, you should not be able to see them. So if you drew, I drew a little bit darker so the camera could pick it up. So I'm going to go in there and erase those right now. There. So I can see them. It's a little bit harder to see them through the camera. I'm getting up into my lighter values. It's a little choppy back here, so I'm going to go back and kind of smooth that out. I'm going a little bit faster than I normally would because I'm on a little bit of a time crunch here. So now as I'm getting up towards that highlight, I'm going lightest and leaving that highlight completely white. I'm not going to shade that in at all. And now I'm going to go back in and just check my consistency. Make sure I don't have any lighter areas where I don't want them. And that is your sphere.